Hello, welcome to Sophie & Co. I'm Sophie Shepard-Natze. The relations between the US and the EU are in turmoil with uncertainties over Brexit and calls for a new European army. Are the tensions temporary or a major divide in the making? I talked to Matthew Borers, a veteran CIA analyst and a former National Intelligence Counselor who's also taking part in the EMERTAC Conference 2018.
The transatlantic alliance between the US and Europe is splitting at the seams, with EU leaders and President Trump trading jabs, NATO solidarity in question, and a trade negotiation lockdown. Is Western unity a thing of the past? How will the long-term allies handle living apart if the split gets out of hand? And what needs to happen to heal the transatlantic rift?
Matthew Borers, thanks a lot for being with us today. It's great to meet you in person, because I know we've done this over the satellite. Lots to talk about, and I think things have changed from the last time we spoke. We'll start with United Kingdom. The future of the Brexit deal is still uncertain, and U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has said that the United States will keep its very special relationship with the United Kingdom even if the hard Brexit is the case, is the scenario. And I remember when Trump was in the United Kingdom, he was actually supporting the rebellious conservatives who are calling, for a hard Brexit. So is a no deal right now something that is convenient for Washington? Is that what Washington really wants, and why?
No, I don't think they would want a no deal, simply because it causes huge amount of confusion. It certainly will tip Britain into recession, but it could tip also Europe. And, we're on the edge. There are a lot of economists believe that we're headed into a recession, so this could be a factor that, tips or helps to tip everybody. So from that standpoint, Washington doesn't want it.
Trump's remarks kind of undermining the British Prime Minister, they don't really fit into this special relationship, true friendship narrative that UK and United States have shared for decades and decades. How close and how special is the relationship with Trump at helm of America, really?
How special is it with the British?
Yeah.
I think, first, I'm not sure that the special relationship will be that special after they leave the EU. Because for Americans, Britain was the entryway into the European Union, both in an economic sense, but also in a political sense, because they represented U.S. views at the table, and the U.S. is not at the table in the European Union.
But to be fair, America and Britain shared special relationship even before the EU was created.
Yes, and we'll always share those values, and lots of Americans feel very close to Britain. That's where, if they start on a European trip, they tend to go to London before they go to the other capitals. But I don't believe it's quite as special. I mean, the cultural values will be there, and the closeness that way, but not as much in a political sense. And then the trade deal that the U.S. negotiates is probably going to be pretty hard for some Brits to take, because the U.S. will demand the opening of their agricultural sector. Mm-hmm. So the U.S. is not going to give them a soft deal. So
Trump's peculiar approach to his overseas counterparts, whether it's London or whether it's Brussels, is this his personal thing, or is this really right now a truly new lasting vector of American foreign policy?
Well, his kind of, let's say, erratic behavior, where he got on the radio when he was in Britain and supported the prime minister's opponents, I think that will go away, because, U.S. is presidents try to be pretty consistent, pretty predictable. Trump is the opposite of that. But I think there is a new attitude in the U.S., largely from the degree that U.S. is oriented much more to China, and China is the peer competitor. Europe more and more should be on its own. Now, that's not to say that the NATO alliance is going to disappear, but U.S. would share both sides of the aisle would share his view that the Europeans need to do more for their defense.
All right, so we'll get to defense and NATO, but what you're saying basically is that under the disguise of his erratic behavior, Trump is actually a gateway to what really Americans want in terms of their relationship with Europe.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, then there is not just, of course, the British Prime Minister, but Trump and the French President, Emmanuel Macron, have also somewhat had a spat. Trump criticized the French government's policies in light of the clashes that were challenging his country, and then the French Foreign Minister was like, just leave our nation be and back off. Can Trump's Twitter diplomacy actually fuel more anti-Macron protests in France? What do you think?
No, I think, I don't think the Gilets jaunes, as they're called, yellow vests, actually like Trump that much. They are opposed to Macron, but I think, Trump has much more of a connection with the British Brexiteers. On the continent, he doesn't have that rapport, and people feel largely in most countries in Europe, Italy may be an exception because he does have some connections there with the populists, but for the most part, he's not that well liked.
So why is that what started between Trump and Macron, something that they wanted to present as a close friendship, actually turned into a series of jabs and insults?
Well, Macron had an idea that he could turn the president away from leaving the Paris Climate Agreement, from particularly when he was on this flattery effort to turn the president away from his commitment to get out of the Iran nuclear agreement, the JCPOA. And that was a big defeat for Macron. And when he went to Washington, that was his number one objective, to try to change that. And then even after that, he wanted to try to get Trump not to sanction U.S. or European companies that were doing business with Iran. U.S. has taken a very hard line on that. They've also taken a very hard line on the European Union trying to develop a facility to allow their companies to trade without getting sanctions. So from that standpoint, all his efforts failed. I think then Macron made this comment that we want a European army, in part because of China, Russia, and then he added the U.S. at the end. For Trump, he wants the Europeans actually to do more for the defense, but always under a U.S. umbrella. I mean, that Macron's comments, which are very much in line with Gaulle's feeling in France, nevertheless looked like it was opposing the U.S.
Mm-hmm. So, but it's one thing for America to want a more independent Europe, but it's another thing for a president to openly disparage his international counterparts supporting ones that challenge them. What's in it for Trump? What is the benefit for America in doing so?
It's for his supporters to show that the U.S. can throw around its weight. The U.S. will not take any guff from, its allies, and that U.S. can berate, has the freedom to berate, but they can't answer the U.S. back. And for a lot of his supporters, that's what they want from a U.S. president. They believe other U.S. presidents have cowered too much in front of Europeans or Asian allies, done too much.
Really? I mean, it's one thing to think so in terms of China, because it's a real competitor, even Russia, because ideologically we don't stand together on the same line. But Europe has always been like a century-long partner and hasn't really challenged America on anything. Like, you take out on that?
Well, for his supporters, standing up, I mean, they feel that the U.S. has been, hurt itself because it has, bent over backwards for its allies. And so this is a great thing, U.S. standing up.
I think a lot of allies would actually say the other way around.
Oh, I totally agree. I'm trying to explain how his supporters see it. This is America first, and that is, that we should be able to tell everybody off, but not expect anybody to come back and criticize us.
So this idea of European army that you mentioned a couple of times has received renewed backing by Germany and by France, and obviously that's all in the wake of Brexit. Trump doesn't really like it. He feels quite skeptical about the plan. If brought to life, do you feel the new EU army could actually make NATO redundant?
Probably not. I mean, it's a stretch for them first to get an army together. But I think what that would do, which U.S., not just Trump, but U.S. policymakers would fear, is make their foreign policy a lot more independent of the U.S.
So why?
It's already moving in that direction just because of Trump's anti-multilateralism, JCPOA, all those issues. But it would make the Europeans, I think, feel that they can set their own policies without necessarily reference to the U.S.
Why does it bother Trump so much then? Why isn't he thrilled about the European army? I mean, having that would surely take load off American military shoulders, and isn't that what he wanted in the first place?
For a lot of even non-Trump foreign policy elite, any sort of talk of a European army appears to them as a threat to NATO. There was a whole argument in the 1990s when the European Union with Maastricht and others began to talk about a foreign policy, European foreign policy, European defense policy, and people in Washington reacted very strongly because the worry is that Europeans would get together without the U.S., make some decisions, and then come into NATO as a collective body and make, force the U.S. to agree to a European position.
We're going to take a short break right now. When we're back, we'll continue talking to Matthew Burrows, a veteran CIA analyst and a former National Intelligence Counselor who is also taking part in 2018 Emmertech conference. Stay with us.
What is the pin that's going to pop the global bubble? Back in 2008, it was the 2008 subprime crisis. Today, I think we can safely say that the bubble will be popped with the collapse of Deutsche Bank.
we're back with Matthew Bowers, a veteran CIA analyst. Mr. Bowers, so if a European Union actually stops relying on Americans for security, would that make the other areas of American-European relationship more complicated, like trade?
Yes. I mean, for a lot of traditional foreign policy members of the elite, there's this bargain that we have this strong defense agreement, and then we also overlay this with a strong economic agreement, and the two need to go side by side. So yes, if U.S. may play more hardball, but in recent times, I mean, even on the economic side, this has been a very difficult relationship, just because there are differences. And we have different ideas on GMOs. We have different ideas on, agricultural sector. The Europeans tend to protect theirs more. We would like them to open it up.
So, just recently, European Union has proposed to deal with this international trade dispute under the WTO. And America has rejected the deal. And I know that in the past, Trump has called WTO counterproductive and useless. What does American attitude mean for the future of WTO? I mean, does Washington want to freeze things just the way they are right now?
Well, I think other than Trump, who, again, is somewhat erratic on this, most Americans would, policymakers would like the WTO reformed, particularly to deal with China. I mean, and they would also want it to be updated because increasingly trade is more digital or getting to be more digital. And that was not really part of the scene when the WTO was put together. So
it doesn't have that much have to do with Europeans, because I was thinking maybe America could actually, get more concessions out of the EU by threatening to withdraw from WTO.
I don't think that would play in Europe, that sort of threat. What would actually bring EU and US together is more the reform of the WTO to attack what they see as unfair trading practices by China. And both Europeans and Americans have complained about China. Mm-hmm.
But what is the worst case scenario if we imagine it, that America withdraws from WTO, for Europe and WTO? What would that mean for the organization? Would it collapse? I mean, after all, you've said it yourself, there are other countries to trade with, like China.
I think it would collapse, particularly, I don't think the Europeans alone, and even if China says it wants to stay in the WTO, I think what you're seeing anyways is more regionalization of trade, and then some even before Trump, President Obama had this idea for regional agreements. So one with Europe, this was TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, so with Asian allies. So we're far away from the global trade agreements that a decade or so ago we had.
So interestingly enough, one of the concerns that the European Union and America share in common is China's economic expansion or expansionism. Do you think if you're China could actually pull EU and America back together?
Well, China is trying. I mean, one thing, China has influence in some East European countries, Hungary being one, Greece, others, who are getting a lot of benefits from China. So there is that, and Europeans in Brussels are very worried about that. So there's some division there. But I think, yes, so long as they don't want to be dragged into a conflict, an American conflict with China. And they don't like the kind of blustery, very anti-China insults and others that sometimes Trump and some of his people engage in, who would like to, push China back a few decades to where it isn't a threat. I mean, they don't like that sort of attitude. China, on its side, I think, would like to strengthen its ties with Europe to avoid a common front that would also include Japan.
Well, actually, funny you mentioned Japan, because this Beijing investment thing is coming under so much scrutiny in the EU that it reminds me of the 80s. There was the very similar fear of all Japanese and Japanese investment, and the Japanese are buying everything. I don't know if we can compare the scale of Japan and China, but it's very much like what was going on. There's this anti-Japan hysteria economically in the 80s. Is it justified to fear China so much? Or is it just going to go away like the Japan fear in the 80s?
I don't think it's going to go quite away, because I think, Japan entered a long period of decline just about the time that people were worried that it was going to take over the world. I think, China, much bigger economic power, much more long-term. I think you have to live with it. And there's lots of advantages that the Europeans get from it, as well as Americans, and have gotten from China. So we need to, certainly some of their trade practices.
But do you think we should just
you can push back
give in
on
to China? Because
No.
at this point, you said Hungary and Greece, and yeah, they're certainly enjoying great financial benefits from a relationship with China.
They don't have the ability probably to push back, because they want the investments too much. But the rest, the European Union has the power to push back.
But how so? Because every time something comes up, like countries like Hungary and Greece, they're actually blocking EU resolutions condemning Beijing's foreign policy. I mean, yes, we don't want the Chinese. Yes, we have this anti-Chinese hysteria, but then the Chinese influence in Europe is so big that it goes as far as vetoing the Brussels resolutions.
Yes, but you have the member states like Germany, France, others begin to put restrictions on investments. And, it's one thing China can invest in Hungary and Greece, but what they really want are German high-tech companies, because they want to learn from the Germans. So that is a way of restricting. Brussels has allowed, there's an EU resolution that was agreed that allows member states to begin to put investment controls on China.
So while EU is locked in its trade dispute with China, America and China, the leaders are actually talking it out in terms of trade war. What do you think will come out of it? Because Trump does that a lot. Like, he first goes against something and then negotiates a deal on his own terms.
I think because Chinese growth at the moment is beginning to soften, they're very worried about that for political reasons, that they will want a deal. They also know that they rely on the U.S. for chips and other things, some of their companies, CTE, so that they will make a deal. But what I fear is that what the lessons they draw from this is that the U.S. is determined not to allow them to continue to rise, and that they will make sure that in 5 years they will not be dependent on the U.S. or anybody else for some of these vital tech inputs like chips, and that what you'll see is maybe not made in China in 2025, but it will be certainly made in China in 2035. Because they are also looking at the rhetoric, which is, we will never allow China to be better than we are.
I want to talk a bit about your recent report that you co-authored. It actually points out further escalation between West and Russia as one of the major geopolitical risks we're going to face in 2019. But I mean, these escalations and these risks, they are rooted in people's decisions. It's not like they're inevitable, right? So do you feel there's any will in Washington to steer away from the collision course?
With Russia?
Yeah.
Not at the moment, and I don't see when it will. I think it will change, but I don't see when it will change.
What would it take for it to change?
I think one thing is a stronger president. You know, this President Trump has ceded all his powers on Russia to Congress, who basically can determine when the sanctions come off. The president really doesn't have that many powers. So I think you need a stronger president. And I think you need maybe, you know, a Democrat coming in who gets elected so that they can turn the page on their defeat in 2016. And say that they defied all the, you know, Russian interventions or whatever. It's time to actually.
Democrats right now in America are even more adamantly anti-Russian than the Republicans. I mean, I don't know if we can say that, but that's my impression.
But you can get a leader that has a different point of view, and I think, you know, we'll
Trump had a different point of view, and look what happened to him. I mean, they almost ate him alive.
Yes, but this is a little bit like Nixon and China. So the strongest anti-communist is the one that opens the door to relations with communist China. It will be the Democrats who can actually say, okay, we need to have relations because otherwise we'll get into an arms race. This will get worse. You know, unfortunately, a casualty of this is probably going to be New START because the timing doesn't work. It expires February 2021. That's a month after whoever's elected the next president, whether it's Trump or a Democrat.